It was just after dawn when the German convoy rolled down the narrow French road, engines humming low, tires crunching gravel as 9 trucks followed each other nose to tail through the quiet countryside. And the drivers felt safe because they'd made this run dozens of times before without a single problem. Too safe, really, because that kind of confidence can get you killed in war, especially when you're hauling supplies through territory you think is cleared but might not be. No planes overhead meant the sky was friendly, or at least neutral, and no gunfire meant the Americans had already pulled back. Or so they believed, leaving nothing behind but empty fields and silence. Then the first truck lurched hard to the right, and the engine screamed like metal tearing itself apart, and the road erupted in a blast that sent dirt and gravel flying 20 feet into the air. Everything stopped. The German soldiers had moved supplies this way dozens of times before, and nothing had ever gone wrong because the Americans had already pulled back. Or so intelligence reports kept saying, leaving only silence and empty roads behind them as they retreated to regroup somewhere to the west. The convoy commander leaned out of his cab, confused and angry, trying to understand why the lead truck sat crooked in the road with smoke rising from the engine compartment as men jumped out yelling and pointing at something on the ground. Then the second truck exploded, and fire bloomed under the chassis, and men scattered in every direction. Then the third truck went up, and panic spread faster than the flames could consume the fuel tanks. What those soldiers didn't know, couldn't have known even if they'd stopped to search every inch of that road, was that a single American engineer had been here hours earlier, working alone in the dark with freezing mud soaking through his uniform as he tied a shoelace tighter than it was ever meant to be tied and turned it into a weapon. It wasn't a joke, wasn't luck, wasn't some accident that worked out in his favor. It was deadly thinking under pressure. The kind of improvisation that separates soldiers who survive from soldiers who don't when everything else has run out. Quick thing before we continue. If you enjoy real World War II stories like this that sound almost impossible but actually happened, hit subscribe and join WW2 Vault because we dig up these moments every week. And trust me, they only get crazier from here. The truth is, this wasn't some secret super weapon or rare piece of gear pulled from a laboratory where scientists worked on experimental devices, but a desperate idea born on a cold road where American engineers had almost nothing left to work with except their training, their nerve, and whatever they could scavenge from their own equipment. And somehow, against all reasonable odds, it worked better than anyone could have predicted. By 1944, German supply convoys had become nervous targets, moving fast when they could and hugging the same roads again and again because fuel was short and time was worse. And every delay meant units at the front went hungry or ran out of ammunition at the worst possible moment. The German army still believed in its control of ground movement, especially in areas they thought were cleared of American forces after recent fighting had pushed the front lines west. Roads were lifelines, and every single truck carried food, fuel, or ammunition that units at the front badly needed to keep fighting, and losing even one truck could slow an attack for hours. Losing 9 trucks could stop an entire operation cold and force commanders to rethink their plans while soldiers waited and wondered when supplies would arrive. American combat engineers knew this better than anyone because their job wasn't just building bridges or clearing paths through destroyed villages, but breaking the enemy's ability to move freely, cutting supply lines, and making every German advance as costly and slow as possible. Mines were their main tool, their go-to weapon for denying roads and choke points. But mines weren't endless, and by late 1944, some units ran dangerously low while others ran out completely. When that happened, engineers had to get creative or watch German trucks roll right past them untouched, delivering the supplies that would help kill American soldiers down the line. That was the exact problem facing one US engineer that night as his unit pulled back after a long day of fighting that had left everyone exhausted, low on ammunition, and ready to collapse. Orders were clear as crystal, the kind of orders that don't leave room for interpretation or excuses. Delay the enemy. Slow them down. Buy time for the main force to regroup and dig in properly. But his mine kit was nearly empty, just one damaged anti-tank mine that wouldn't arm properly and a few odd pieces that couldn't do much on their own. And the road ahead was absolutely perfect for a convoy, narrow and slightly curved, bordered by soft ground that would bog down any vehicle trying to leave the pavement. Walking away felt wrong, felt like surrendering ground without a fight. so he made the decision to stay behind and see what he could do with what little he had left. He studied the road in the pale moonlight, listening to distant engines rumbling somewhere to the east and feeling the cold creep into his hands as he thought through every option available. Every trick he'd learned in training. Every story he'd heard from other engineers about improvised weapons that had worked when nothing else could. He had one damaged anti-tank mine that couldn't arm properly through normal means. Some wire that was meant for field communications. A few basic tools that every engineer carried, and the laces from his own boots. It wasn't much, certainly not enough for a proper ambush under normal circumstances. But it might be enough if he could make it work. Instead of trying to fix the mine the normal way, which would have been impossible without replacement parts he didn't have, he did something risky, something they definitely hadn't taught him in engineering school. He turned it into a trigger trap, carefully burying the explosive charge under the thinnest possible layer of dirt and gravel that would still hide it from view. Then threading a shoelace through the firing pin system and stretching it tight across the road at exactly the right height. The shoelace had to be low enough that a truck axle would snag it and yank the pin free, but high enough to avoid being triggered by boots or animals that might wander across the road before the convoy arrived. It took time, way too much time, and every noise made his heart jump as he worked slowly in the darkness with fingers going numb from the cold. Tying knots by feel more than sight because any light would have given away his position. He tested the tension once, pulling gently on the shoelace to make sure it would hold but still release when hit hard. Then tested it again because getting it wrong meant the whole thing would fail. He knew that if the tension was too loose, nothing would happen and the convoy would pass safely. But if it worked, if everything went according to plan, the first truck would never see it coming. Never have a chance to brake or swerve or warn the others. He finished the setup just before dawn broke over the horizon, checked his work one last time, and then slipped away into the fields, leaving behind what looked like an empty, harmless road that showed no signs of tampering. Hours later, right on schedule, the convoy arrived, engines running smooth, drivers relaxed and probably thinking about breakfast or whatever soldiers think about when they believe they're safe. The first truck hit the shoelace at speed, probably doing 30 miles per hour, and the front axle yanked the firing pin free with enough force to overcome the resistance. The mine went off directly under the engine compartment, lifting the entire front end off the ground and killing the vehicle instantly in a blast that could be heard for miles. The second truck, following too close behind because the drivers felt safe, slammed into the burning wreck before the driver could even touch the brake pedal. And the impact snapped another tripwire that set off a second charge the engineer had positioned nearby. Fire filled the road, flames spreading from one vehicle to another, and men screamed as they scrambled to escape the heat and smoke. Drivers further back in the convoy tried to turn around, tried to back up and find another route, but the road was too tight and the shoulders too soft, and as trucks reversed or stalled trying to maneuver, hidden charges that had been carefully placed detonated one after another. Each blast fed by panic and bad spacing and the chaos that comes when a routine mission turns into a nightmare. In less than a minute, 9 trucks were destroyed or burning, some flipped on their sides, others twisted into unrecognizable wreckage, completely blocking the road and turning a simple supply run into an absolute disaster that would be talked about in German headquarters for days. German soldiers scattered into the fields on both sides of the road, firing at shadows and yelling for officers who couldn't fix what had already happened, couldn't undo the damage or call back the lost supplies. The convoy was finished, done, completely out of action. Supplies that were desperately needed at the front were gone, burned to nothing or buried under tons of twisted metal. The road was closed, impassable, and would stay that way for hours while recovery teams struggled to clear the wreckage. Later reports from American intelligence showed that the delay caused by that single ambush forced nearby German units to halt their advance for hours, waiting for supply trucks and recovery teams that never came on time because the entire logistics chain had been disrupted. During that pause, those critical hours when German forces sat waiting for fuel and ammunition, American forces regrouped and strengthened their defensive line just enough to hold against the attack that finally came. That shoelace mine, that improvised weapon made from scraps and desperation, had bought exactly the time that was needed. For the engineer who made it happen, there was no medal ceremony, no newspaper headline, No photograph of him standing proud in front of generals. Just a brief note in an after-action report describing an improvised anti-tank mine triggered by a bootlace. Simple words for a moment that showed exactly how desperate and clever the war had become by late 1944. Stories like this still matter today, because they showed that World War II wasn't only won by massive tank battles and thousand-plane bombing raids, but by individual people who refused to give up when the standard tools ran out and they had to make do with whatever they could find. American engineers learned fast that ideas could be just as powerful as steel, especially when the enemy assumed the road ahead was safe and let their guard down. By the end of the war, German records listed countless lost convoys blamed on mines, ambushes, and sabotage operations. Many of them never fully explained or understood because the Americans who set them up were already long gone by the time anyone investigated. Behind several of those losses was an engineer making life or death decisions alone, in the dark, with whatever materials he had left, turning ordinary objects into weapons through nothing but creativity and nerve. That morning, the road looked quiet again after the smoke finally cleared and the fires burned themselves out. But the damage was done and couldn't be undone. 9 trucks never reached the front lines. 9 loads of fuel and ammunition never got distributed to the units that needed them. And 1 thin shoelace, the kind of thing you'd never think twice about in normal life, proved that in war, even the smallest, most ordinary thing can stop an army in its tracks when used by someone who knows what they're doing. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault, where we uncover the moments that history books barely mention but soldiers never forgot. The small victories and clever tricks that added up to winning the war. If you want more real combat stories like this, stories about ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things with whatever they had, hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.